Okay, so this afternoon we're going to talk about what do we need to crack mobility as a service. And what we're starting to see now is a lot of interest in this idea of MaaS. How do we get commuters to move by a variety of ways from a variety of companies using a variety of vehicles, but through one single app with one payment gateway? And it's obviously highly complex. I live and work in Paris, where I run an annual event called Autonomy on urban mobility. And I have 15 mobility apps on my smartphone. One of them being Bird, one being Uber, one being SNCF, one RATP, etc., etc. And I have to toggle between each app, trying to figure out which is the best way to go from A to B. And obviously, if those were onto one app and one payment gateway, I could very easily decide a route that would link all of the different vehicles together to get from A to B. So what we have on our panel this afternoon is people who work for companies that are trying to give us an alternative to single car ownership and single car driving predominantly in cities. And we're going to start off just with a very short introduction each, where they can have a 1 or 2 minute pitch to tell you, the audience, what they do and who they are. Starting with Alexandre, who's head of digital at SNCF, which is the biggest railroad operator in the world, correct?
I'll let you say that, yeah, probably. Thank you. I'm Alex Viros, and I'm head of digital at SNCF. SNCF is the French national railway company, and as head of digital, we have our e-commerce website, which is called We SNCF. We also have Rail Europe, which sells European train tickets to non-Europeans. But more interestingly, and going to our point today, we have our mobility as a service platform that we're developing on another app, which is called the SNCF app, which has 13 million people that have it, and it's exactly going to be doing what you're saying. And to do all this, we have our own digital factory. We have above 1,000 people working in this digital factory for us, but also for the rest of the group, because for the last 20 years at SNCF, we believe that having our own tech and digital assets and resources was strategic and was a strategic component in what we do, which is not necessarily what you think a national railway or public transport operator would do. So this is what we do.
Thanks, Alexandre. Next up, we have YJ, who is the VP at Bird. I arrived from Paris yesterday, and first thing I noticed in Tel Aviv was Bird scooters. Obviously, in Paris, they are one of the 11 scooter operators on the streets. And tell us a bit about Bird.
Hi there, I'm YJ Fischer. I'm the Vice President of Government Partnerships at Bird, and we created the scooter industry in Santa Monica in California, and now you see scooters all over the world. You see a number of companies all over the world. I would say that we still are the company that is leading the industry in terms of creating the safest vehicle. Safety is one of the things that we care about most as this industry grows, and so we are really focused on what is the next generation of scooter technology that is going to be safer, more durable, more sustainable, greater life cycle use over time. So we're doing a lot of interesting stuff at Bird, and in particular for this conversation, we take a radically different approach than some of the rideshare companies when it comes to sharing data with cities. So I think one of the things that'll be interesting to talk about today is how we can help policymakers understand how people are moving around cities, so then they can make different decisions or better decisions about where they're building their infrastructure.
Thanks, YJ. So next up, we have Miska from Helsinki Business Hub. Helsinki has become quite famous with MaaS because the founder of MaaS Global, Sampo Heitman, is from there. And now there's another interesting company called QD, who has a white label solution for MaaS. Yeah, over to you.
Okay, I come from Helsinki Business Hub, which is a local city-owned company helping the foreign companies to actually do business in Helsinki. And one of the areas where I've been responsible for has been platform development. And we started with the local companies on developing the business platforms that they could actually establish new type of business models. And one of the areas has been mobility as a service. And it has been started with the kind of like having the players like Wim and those guys and opening up the data, opening up the APIs for public transportation system, and those are really available for other companies as well. So it's a really great place to pilot your stuff and see how the future of mobility is being built in Helsinki. So.
And finally, we have Thomas on the end. Thomas is based in Israel, and he is working on a monorail system, but a hanging monorail system. I've described it badly. Over to you. Quick introduction of what your company is looking at doing.
Thank you. Okay, so basically what we're offering is a different type of transportation solution, which is an elevated, let's say, glideway, brings traffic to the third dimension from point to point. One glideway would be equivalent to 6 lanes of traffic in terms of the capacity. So basically all these solutions that you have here would be complementary to what we have, or we would be complementary to what they have. So the idea is there's no more room on the roads for anything that's metal that has wheels on it, and it doesn't matter what shape it is or how autonomous it is. You got to move people to a different dimension, either below ground, which is too expensive, or above ground, which is obviously what we're trying to do. We have a full-scale development already done. We've done propulsion, flight, and also switching from one level to another, which means that you get on and you get off where your destination is. So that's what we're doing right now.
Thank you. So what we have in every city is we have 3 big problems. One is congestion. The other is pollution, mainly caused by the petrol and diesel fumes, particles 2.5 PM 2.5s and nitrous oxide in Europe. And then the third problem we have obviously is carbon emissions. So despite the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, the record carbon emissions were year of 2018, and the highest quarter's carbon emissions was the first quarter of 2019. So what we see is that cities are finding it incredibly hard to reduce pollution, congestion, and carbon emissions. One of the ways we can do that is to offer commuters a better experience door to door than owning a motor car and leaving your house and arriving in your office in a motor car. The big challenge, obviously, is who will share their data with who and who is prepared to go onto whose platform. Because if I'm a platform owner and Bird is on my platform, I can see the mobility use and the mobility pattern, and I might decide later to compete with Bird because I have all that data and information. So first question to you, Alexander, for your solution to work, you obviously have a monopoly on the train line, but you don't have a monopoly from the home to the train line. So I live in the 9th in Paris. I need to get to Gare du Nord to go to London. How will you work with Bird, for example, or Uber to get those solutions onto your platform that I can move door to door from my home to a meeting in London, for example?
Yeah, so the solution we're developing right now, and we're launching our MVP this month, and it'll keep on evolving until the end of the year, is a solution where we will be aggregating all sorts of means of transportation, whether it's a taxi, whether it's a scooter, whether it's a bicycle. So that's quite new, and we'll be one of the first ones to do it at this scale in Europe. And when we look at companies like Bird or any other company we can mention, well, the deal is pretty clear that we say, well, we have this large audience, we have this public transport operator image that, people don't love us, but they trust us. And that's very true about public transport operators. So we bring all this to other operators. They share the data with us, but we're also ready to share the data with them in reciprocally. So we do all this, but what you were saying is everybody wants to aggregate everyone. Everyone wants to be the aggregator. No one wants to be aggregated. That's true, but it's kind of silly because there's one thing we need to mention, or we should mention, is that you mentioned it at the beginning, we're all fighting against people driving their cars alone. In a country like France, which is a little different from the rest of Europe, there's still 80% of people that use their car alone to travel. So that's the size of the pie. So if we're only looking at the 20% that we're sharing, well, that's really silly because we're competing against each other on this small chunk of the business. If we look at the 80%, and if we can make this 80% into a 70 or 60%, then we will have won the war against congestion, pollution, and we would have helped the business grow. So that's one thing. The second thing, I'm sorry, but that you didn't mention, and we need to mention, beyond congestion, maybe I'm saying this because I'm France and you've probably read about the yellow vests in France. The yellow vest movement started as a mobility crisis in France, but not in big cities, in low density areas. And that's something we also need to talk about when we talk about MaaS, is how do we help people who don't have access to public transportation? how do we not lie to them by saying, well, we're going to be building trains and train stations all over the place, and that's the solution, because that's not feasible? How do we manage to aggregate the potential supply or inventory of mobility that exists there, but that they don't have access to? So that's the second thing we need to do as a public transport operator.
So, YJ, over to you. I mean, Bird has deployed scooters faster, quicker than anybody else. I mean, how many users do you have in the world at the moment for a company that's a couple of years old?
God, it's really hard to say, but I mean, millions of rides, right, in the scooter industry. It's just absolutely incredible how it's taken off, and you can even see it in Tel Aviv just walking around.
And would you be prepared to go onto, for example, an SNCF app, and that the SNCF's 13 million users could now book their scooter through the SNCF app? Would that be an interesting business proposition to a company like Bird, or do you want to try and hold that commuter and get their purchase path through your app?
I think it's such a good question. I think obviously SNCF is one of the premier transportation companies across Europe. One could easily imagine SNCF actually being the kind of aggregator for companies like a Bird, like an Uber. One of the things that we were talking about backstage that I think is also true is that governments are actually really well placed to play the aggregator role. So when we think about in the very short term, it is much more, we're already doing it, which is that we're sharing our data with cities at an unprecedented level. And in fact, I happen to know in Los Angeles, the Department of Transportation is trying to create a new system for how the city is processing data through MDS, and we are part of that effort in helping them shape how they're collecting data, what they are doing with the data, and trying to create a consortium around how the industry should respond. One of the things that I have found fascinating talking to governments all around the world is oftentimes I'll be there and we'll start a conversation about scooters and we'll talk about, okay, we're sharing our data, we're very open about our data, and then we'll be at the table with the rideshare industry, and as soon as it switches over to talking about rideshare, the data conversation stops, right? We're not gonna share this. So I think from where I sit, the first level is the sharing of information with government, because it is very clear how a city will benefit from understanding how people are moving around the city. I then think the second order question becomes, which is going to be the private sector industry leader that helps to aggregate all these different players for ease of the user.
Yeah, so it's obviously one thing sharing data. I mean, Uber, by the way, also shares their data through a platform that they call Movement. It's another thing, a city understanding that data and turning transport data into transport management tools or into a MaaS platform. I mean, Miska, over to you. I mean, what is the city of Helsinki wanting to do, and how is it able to use data from private operators and turn that into a MaaS platform?
Well, first of all, the city has actually opened up quite a lot of data. So we have Helsinki Region Fischer, which is opening quite a lot of data about city and plans and traffic and so on, and even the weather conditions and all of that. And there's plenty of players who are actually building on top of that. So they create some proprietary data on top of that, and even can sell that data as something valuable information for other players. But I think that the city in general is kind of a really good source for a certain level of data that people can utilize. And then you can actually start exploring different areas that kind of inviting companies to, hey, we have this amount of data available, so you can actually play around and work together. But in general, when talking about the transportation, and really the need for that is really inside the city, and the city is really the key in providing these opportunities and providing these new models. Because every city has its own unique characteristics. In Tel Aviv, you have certain type of traffic jams, and in weather conditions. In Finland, you might have a bit different. And typically, cities are seeing the kind of whole mixture of things, what can be done, what should be done, and where the challenge is. And from that perspective, I see that cities are really as a driving force behind the mobility as a service. Because in certain places, you might actually use the scooters, but during the winter time in Finland, I'm sorry, scooters are not really available because of the snow and everything. So you need to find alternative solutions, and somebody needs to understand the whole big picture. And unless people are willing to have those 15 plus apps on their phones, I think they are much more looking at, okay, I have this Helsinki app, and then I have this Paris app, and then I have this Tel Aviv app. That would be much better way of kind of like solving the problem. And of course, all of the players could integrate on those platforms. But I really see that kind of like when people actually need to travel, most likely it's somehow related to the area where you are actually living at or where you're actually commuting to.
And who would run that app in Helsinki? Would it be the city of Helsinki? Would it be a private company on behalf of the city? Would it be the city's public transport operator?
Currently, we are seeing several different players. So we have private players. We have actually kind of like a public transportation player. They are kind of opening up a certain amount of APIs for the private players to actually work on their system as well. But ultimately, it's about who owns the customer, and I don't have a solution for that. I think it's a fair and open game at the moment. So like everybody can play around, but I see that the cities have this role of kind of like providing information and enabling all of this happen. And it could be the public player, it could be some of the private players, it could be depending on city and places that you have different players and different winners on this game. It could be that in the US you have different like players like Uber is really taking over and certain things, or in Asia might be a bit different, and in Europe in different places. So, but currently we are in this transition phase where people are actually kind of considering, hey, should I actually own a car anymore? Because I can actually take this as a service and utilize the public transportation when I need it, and take the shared rides and all of that. So like but it will evolve, and I think this is really great times of seeing different companies and different opportunities and different initiatives going around different places.
Okay, so before I get to Thomas, who's got a disruptive solution, I have a couple of points. One, obviously, Alexandre's point about the Gilets jaunes in Paris. I'm not too sure it was a mobility problem. I think it was a tax on fuel that caused a large percentage of the population who were budget constrained to start protesting. And obviously, one of the big challenges we have is trying to get mobility into rural areas, because the Gilets jaunes had very little alternative but car ownership, which is effectively the same point you're making. And what we're seeing with all the operators, they want to be in dense cities like Paris, Amsterdam, and nobody wants to be in the rural areas. So that's something that is a place where there's a massive mobility need, but not much offer from the private sector because there's not the density to get the return on investment. I mean, Thomas, you have a vision of a very different mobility system that would disrupt car ownership, but would also disrupt existing infrastructure like metros and trains. Do you believe that you'll be able to offer faster, better mobility at a fraction of the price to the existing public transport infrastructure?
Without a question. There's no doubt that our solution is returning the CapEx and the OpEx, which is something that no mass transportation solution can offer in the world today. And all the data points that you guys are talking about, imagine you leave your home, our system would be, you'd be wanting to tell our system, and it would be run by an operator, all right? It would understand that you're coming, you're approaching the station. So when it comes to designing the actual network, the city would say, we need data, right? So we know where to put the stations and how big the stations should be and what the capacity would need. And then as we start small, because we would start small in certain places, and then we would build out, right? Networking. You start with point-to-point in the worst plot, and then you network it out. And then what's nice about this solution relative to what you asked about the rural aspect is that when you have something that returns the investment in the dense areas, because you can have algorithmically controlled pricing, so you keep the price high in high demand, and in the opposite direction low. So you get this return on investment of your CapEx of the mass transportation solution. Then you can use that extra capital that you get to fund taking this out to rural areas and then connecting them to other rural areas, which then are connected to dense areas. So now you have a complete network that gridded out in a country where you actually do what the whole point of getting people out of their car. And it's fun to elevated, you get to have a nice view, you relax, and you go at a pretty high speed without any traffic lights or being arrested for whatever.
And you have a prototype in Israel, in Tel Aviv, is that correct?
Well, we have a full-scale development here in Israel in Tasiya Avirit. It's Israeli aerospace industry. That's a 750 kilogram vehicle traveling at 70 kilometers an hour. We've demonstrated propulsion, flight, and also switching from one altitude to another for its stations.
And where would you be the first? Which city would be the first deployment? Do you have any commitments from any cities?
I have my own personal opinion, which I hope it's in Eilat as a pilot, and then as a point to point from the new airport, Ramon, to the city. That's the high demand and very simple, flat, and it's without a lot of obstacles like bridges and things. But it could be Netanya or Herzliya, which have really big problems.
Okay. YJ, back to you. I mean, obviously, scooters have attracted a huge amount of attention. They, are a very disruptive solution in that they, replace a lot of the first and last mile, which has been done by ride-hailing or taxis or motor cars. In my opinion, scooters are a great solution with a business, with the wrong business model. And the reason why I say this is that in Paris there are 11 scooter operators. There's no way that Paris can sustain 11 operators. And all of them are over-deploying scooters, hoping to get market share and hoping that the competition will die before them. And what we see in Paris is just an over-deployment of scooters on the pavement, the public starting becoming anti-scooter because they feel that they are a nuisance. They're actually a very good mobility solution. So the question I ask you is that, wouldn't there be a better business model where scooter operators like yourselves go onto existing MaaS platforms and start operating straight away as per the demand, and not over-deploy hoping that the competition will die before you? And what happens with that, obviously, is one, you get an over-deployment of scooters creating congestion on the sidewalks. The second is that there is a lot of embedded carbon in the manufacture of a scooter because it's aluminium and battery, and you don't want waste of those vehicles like we've seen with the free-floating Chinese bicycles.
So I actually think what's really interesting is if you look at cars as an analog. So if you think about it, there are many different kinds of cars that you can buy, and there are many different places that you can go and buy cars, and one might argue that there is an oversupply of cars because you can go to a car shop and purchase one.
There is an oversupply of cars. That's what we're trying to get rid of. 1.2 billion in the world. Yeah.
And so when you look at scooters by comparison, what we are seeing is nothing on that order of magnitude. So one of the things that's really interesting, I would say, actually 2 points. One thing is that in general, you will have market forces over time that will actually help ensure that scooters are not out there if they're not being used. I do think in a city like Paris right now, there are a variety of factors, and it will take a while for those market forces to catch up. I do think, though, if you look at Tel Aviv, we did a survey in Tel Aviv, and we asked users, what is your biggest complaint about scooters? And one of the things we heard was lack of supply. And if you look at Tel Aviv as a great example, Paris is also a great example of a place where scooters are actually being ridden an incredible number of times. It really is a shared vehicle. We're seeing utilization rates that are off the charts. That's part of why more companies are entering the space, and then why you have more of the oversupply. I do think over time it will balance itself out. I think part of the question becomes, what are you comparing it to? If it's how many scooters are on the road today compared to a year and a half ago, well, then there is a dramatic increase, because there were no scooters really a year and a half ago, maybe aside from Tel Aviv, where there's always been a high personal scooter usage rate. But if you look at most cities, we're brand new. But if you compare us to how many cars are on the road, and if you think about the fact that most car trips around the world are for under 3 miles, a ride for which you could take a scooter, arguably, we have the ratio completely wrong. We should have more scooters and dramatically fewer cars.
And as a company, what is your long-term strategy? Are you wanting to become like a Grab that has 15 different services on their app? So effectively, Grab is the Southeast Asian equivalent of Uber, and they are winning the race as a single operator MaaS. You can have ride-hailing, ride-pooling, shuttle, long-term car rental, food delivery, etc., etc. I think Uber's got 5 different services on their app at the moment. But will Bird try and introduce more services? Will Bird try and find partnerships with people like SNCF who have big user bases and try and provide the first and last mile for their passengers?
So I never want to say never, but in general, we are not a car company. We are dedicated to the mission of getting cars off the road. So things like shared ride vehicles or shuttles or anything of the sort is not something that I envision in the short term. What I do imagine is other forms of multimodal transportation, whether that's things that look like a combination of scooters and bikes, and we just had an announcement around this. We're coming out with a lot of different form factors, and I think part of it is better understanding the market and how people like to get around. So one of the things that's been very interesting is seeing that adoption rate for a scooter is much higher than for a bicycle. For a variety of reasons, people feel like the barrier of entry is much lower. On the other hand, it turns out people also like a seat. So one of the things we're looking at now is something that functions like a scooter but has a seat.
Alexander, question for you. I had a meeting with Transport for London a couple of weeks ago when I was giving a keynote on mobility as a service. And I asked a person from Transport for London if they would ever have a neutral MaaS operator. And their response was, we use taxpayers' money to give them transport and mobility. We don't want to lose that relationship with the taxpayer. We want them at every step of the journey to know that this is their tax money working for them. In other words, it's democracy in action. So SNCF is owned by the state. You're operating your MaaS throughout the state. It's a very good way for the government during election time, particularly to say, this is your taxpayers' money at work. Today we are improving the road for your benefit. Take the train. Or today it's great weather. We suggest you walk and cycle for your health. The most used apps now are news apps and then transport apps. I think they're going to become incredibly powerful places for for governments to communicate with commuters stroke voters. Are you seeing this starting to merge with SNCF? Is it something that you predict? Is it something that concerns you or something that delights you?
Wait, that the government will use us to communicate with your users? With the users? First
Not in a big brother way, but in a friendly way, nudging them to have more active mobility, to keep healthy.
I think, again, going back to our mission and go back to also your question, is like, we're probably not going to be creating other modes of transportation because we're focused on the rail transportation. However, we know that if we want people to take more trains, we probably need to sell them more than just trains. There's great stuff going on in the market because it's very effervescent. People are very creative. There's a lot going on. And if we can do anything that brings the carbon level lower, that makes people's lives easier, then we'll be happy with it. So we're not just seen as, we're not a government tool. We're here to create mobility and make mobility easier for the French people. We started with a train, we started with electrified train, we started with high-speed trains, and now we're doing it through our digital assets.
Quick comment, SNCF runs on nuclear, so it has the lowest carbon footprint of any long-distance travel. I always use SNCF because the carbon footprint is so low because it's predominantly running on nuclear energy. So you could come up with a very low carbon footprint door-to-door by SNCF having the right MaaS app, using things like Bird Scooter, first and last mile, and not combustion vehicles.
Just going back to your point, because there's also something that we haven't been successful at, generally in the French market, is bringing the 80% of people who use their car and drive it alone lower. It's been like that. It's been stagnating for a while, although people have been very creative. And one of the reasons why we think it hasn't gone down, and goes back to the initial point, mobility crisis or not, I don't know, but we haven't yet managed to give them a satisfactory substitute for the car.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, there are 36 million motor cars in France. And what's interesting is the average age of a motor car has got slightly older over the last 5 years as people have got slightly shorter of money. And I think for a lot of the Gilets jaunes, they have old cars which have quite a high cost of ownership, higher than they realize. And that's one of the interesting things that MaaS Global is battling with, is that people underestimate the cost of car ownership. So MaaS Global offers a subscription service at $499 per month, but most people think their car costs them around $250, $300 per month. That's incorrect. Car ownership is around the 500 euros per month. How are you trying to encourage people away from car ownership, understanding that people underestimate the cost of a car ownership, and they obviously don't have to pay for the externalities of pollution and global warming?
Well, first of all, I think the public policies are really helping on that one as well, in terms of like setting these green zones in the cities and kind of like trying to make it sure that people are actually not utilizing their cars to actually go inside the cities. That's one way of kind of like trying to solve that, but you actually, in certain parts of the road, you actually take the car share and then you actually continue with the public transportation and so on. In general, there's a plenty of different options on kind of how you are able to promote this idea, and I think that it's really a generation issue. What I'm seeing, and especially in Finland and in Helsinki, you see the younger generation who actually didn't have own car, so they actually started utilizing public transportation, and then they kind of realized, okay, I might need car every now and then, and they start using these new apps and new kind of like business models where you actually get to use the car whenever you need. And these people are really changing the way how we perceive things. And once you have more and more people like that really utilizing these new services, more people will actually kind of like join them and see that, hey, it doesn't make sense on owning that car and trying to find a parking place inside the city, and I could have something else. And I've seen several cases. One really interesting case was that one person actually kind of lost his car somewhere in Helsinki and ended up kind of like after a couple of months wondering where my car might be, and they actually wandered around the city and eventually found the car. Luckily it was still there and everything was okay and so on, but that tells about kind of like the stories that people are starting to tell that, okay, actually I don't need a car anymore. I need this type of like service that I can utilize car whenever I might need it.
So thanks. Our time is up. So just to finish, I think it's great to have a panel like this where you see a startup like Bird speaking to a massive big company like SNCF, and they speak the same language. I think that would have been quite difficult 5 or 6 years ago. Nice to have someone like Tomo with another one of these very futuristic but exciting solutions that could disrupt the way we move. And obviously Helsinki as a leader in mobility as a service. Thanks very much for the panelists, and thanks to the audience for listening.
Thank you.